First up, we have Sofia Passariello. She is from Long Island, New York. Though through her travels, she has enjoyed taking herself to urban green spaces, passing her time in city parks, which makes a lot of sense why her research has gone in this direction. She will take us to the capital of Austria as she presents her research, where the city breathes, exploring urban climate resilience and public health through green spaces in Vienna, Austria. Sophia, take it away.
Great, thank you so much. All right, let me bring up my slides right here. And then present. Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. Okay, so first, we tend to think of cities and the natural world as polar opposites. But I want you to think, what are we left with when those two boundaries begin to blur together? That idea is what first led me to take a closer look at how these two worlds come together to create something more complex, urban green spaces. This intersection between contrasting environments became the focus of my project, shaped in part by my own personal experiences. For me, they've served as places where I've gone to rest, to socialize, or simply to spend time alone when I need to reset. I wanted to take that personal connection and expand it within the context of our rapidly deteriorating environment. And that's what brings us here today, to my project titled Where the City Breathes, exploring urban climate resilience and public health through green spaces in Vienna, Austria. So, needing hardly any introduction, of course, climate change is what the United Nations has called the defining crisis of our time. Since the mid-19th century, global temperatures have steadily increased, and the rate at which they're increasing is accelerating. What that looks like in practice is more frequent and intense heat waves, rising sea levels, habitat loss, and a sharp increase in climate-related natural disasters. In fact, the number of disasters over the past 30 years has nearly tripled, displacing millions of people worldwide. And at the same time, global progress has been uneven. Many major economies are falling short of their climate goals, which only adds to the urgency of finding solutions that are both effective and scalable. So while climate change is global in scope, the question becomes something else. How do we respond in ways that are tangible on a local level? One of the most immediate ways we experience climate change is through its impact on health. Poor air quality, increased allergens, more frequent wildfires, these all contribute to respiratory issues and other physical health ailments. At the same time, extreme heat and cold lead to temperature-related deaths, particularly among vulnerable populations such as children and the elderly. But the impact isn't only physical. Climate-related disasters and environmental stressors are also linked to increased anxiety, trauma, and long-term mental health challenges. And importantly, these physical and mental effects are closely connected, often reinforcing and exacerbating one another. This becomes even more significant when we consider the ongoing urbanization. By 2050, nearly 70% of the global population is expected to be living in cities. Urban areas already face challenges like heat islands, air pollution, and unequal resource access, all of which intensify the health impacts of climate change. In Europe specifically, this issue is even more pronounced. It is the fastest warming continent on the planet, and cities are at the center of this challenge, and therefore they must also be part of the solution. So this is what led me to my research question. How do community-driven initiatives related to urban green space in Vienna enhance climate resilience by fostering public engagement? And do these efforts also lead to improvements in physical and mental health? I chose Vienna very intentionally. First, the city has made a strong commitment to sustainability with a goal of reaching carbon neutrality by 2040. Second, over half of Vienna is made up of urban green space, making it one of the greenest cities in Europe and giving it a unique physical foundation for my research. And third, Vienna places a strong emphasis on citizen participation in its urban planning. Initiatives like the development of the Office of Participation for the city in 2024 show how public input is actively incorporated into its development. So this combination makes Vienna an ideal case study for understanding how the environmental policy, public engagement, and everyday urban life come together as one. More broadly, urban green spaces themselves offer a significant opportunity. They can reduce urban heat, they can improve air quality, and they create environments that encourage social interaction and physical activity. Research shows these spaces can strengthen community bonds, reduce stress, and even lower rates of illness and mortality in cities. So this project is really exploring how two interconnected ideas are coming together. First, whether these spaces can help cities adapt to climate change, and second, whether the way people engage with them can improve their overall well-being. But before we go further, I think it's important to clarify what I mean when I say urban green space, or UGS, as you'll see on my slides. Urban green space broadly refers to all vegetated areas within a city. So that can be parks, that can be gardens, that can be green roofs, that can be community gardens or smaller spaces even. But however, for the purpose of this project, I am focusing primarily on parks. This is because parks are pretty much the most accessible and widely used form of green space in cities. So to better understand this topic, I conducted a literature review, which revealed 4 major themes that consistently appeared across academic research. Each of these themes have been studied extensively on their own. For example, there's strong evidence that urban green spaces can improve mental and physical health. Other research highlights how these spaces can either reinforce or reduce social inequalities. And at the same time, many studies are also pointing to the environmental benefits of urban green space. And finally, there's a growing body of research showing that when the communities are actively involved in maintaining these spaces, it can strengthen social cohesion and even support broader forms of civic engagement. However, what I found to be missing was a holistic perspective. These themes are typically explored separately rather than as interconnected parts of a larger and more significant system. The gap became particularly important in shaping my methodology. I used these 4 themes that I found as the basis for a deductive coding process, so they directly informed how I analyzed my data and identified patterns in my findings, as you will see. Ultimately, this led to my research purpose: to examine how urban green spaces in Vienna can support civic involvement and community health while also fostering environmental resilience. So, to answer my research question, I conducted a mixed methods case study over 3 months in Vienna, from September to November of 2025. I used an approach combining 3 main methods: participant observation and field notes, semi-structured interviews, and also surveys. The goal was to capture both detailed experiences from individuals, but also broader patterns of behavior through my observations. First, through participant observation, I collected field notes across 14 urban green spaces in 10 of Vienna's 23 districts. These observations focused on how people actually use these spaces. So I would look at things like accessibility, activity, social interaction, and the structure of the overall environment. This provided insight into everyday people's behaviors. Second, I conducted semi-structured interviews with employees involved in community-based environmental initiatives, namely the Vienna Climate Team and Grätzelewasser, which is the Neighborhood Oasis Initiative. These interviews helped explore the broader impact of these initiatives, as well as efforts from behind the scenes to expand or improve upon these projects. And then finally, I used surveys to gather both qualitative and quantitative data from residents. These were distributed in both English and German for the sake of accessibility and focused on usage patterns, health experience, and overall green perceptions. So now we'll get into my findings. So first, to analyze this data, I used a political ecology framework, which focuses on how environmental resources like green space are distributed and accessed, and how policy and power influence those dynamics. So then from my findings, 4 main themes ended up emerging, each of which were supported by 2 sub-themes, as you can see here. These were health impacts, environmental impacts, social justice considerations, and community engagement. Across all 3 data sources, so my field notes, interviews, and surveys, these themes appeared consistently, which strengthened the reliability of these findings. Within health, I found strong evidence for both increased physical activity and improved mental well-being. Parks weren't just spaces where people were exercising, but there were also places where people went for stress relief and relaxation. Environmental impacts were most visible through cooling and biodiversity support. So areas with dense vegetation or water features were noticeably cooler and tended to support more plant and animal life. Social justice focused on accessibility and inclusive participation in the greening programs I spoke with. While many spaces were physically accessible, there were still disparities in how welcome or included people felt, as I found in my surveys. And finally, community engagement emerged through both social infrastructure, so things like gathering spaces, and cultural elements such as festivals, art, memorials. So these spaces became almost social improvements and not just environmental ones. So while the findings were largely positive, there were also clear opportunities for improvement. First, accessibility could be expanded further. Some neighborhoods were more central and densely populated, which tended to lead to less or more crowded green spaces, which limit their benefits. Second, design improvements could also enhance user experience. Survey responses pointed to a desire for quieter spaces commonly, and also more seating in areas for games or gatherings. Third, increased community programming like events or workshops could strengthen engagement or social cohesion further. And finally, ensuring that planning processes remain inclusive is critical. While Vienna has strong participatory models, continued efforts are needed to include marginalized voices and ensure benefits are distributed evenly. But there are several limitations, of course, that are important to acknowledge. First, time constraints meant that observations were conducted over only a 3-month period and primarily during one season, which didn't really capture year-round patterns of usage, especially during like the warmer weather, because I was there in the fall when it was getting pretty cold and rainy. Second, there are practical challenges. Like I said, weather conditions were difficult at times, and we also had some challenges with participant recruitment, which led to a smaller sample size for both my interviews and surveys, and that limits generalizability. Finally, language barriers also limited my ability to interact fully with participants and required some of my data to be translated. However, despite these limitations, the broader implications of this research are significant. This has important implications, especially on urban policy. It suggests that cities should prioritize not only expanding green space, but also making it more accessible, inclusive, and participatory for sustainable planning in the long run. And while this study focuses on Vienna, these insights can be applied more broadly. As urban populations continue to grow and climate risks are continuing to intensify, cities worldwide need strategies that will help support environments, health, and also the community of people living within them. So, to conclude, these findings suggest that urban green spaces support physical and mental well-being, contribute to environmental adaptation, and foster social connection and civic engagement. However, one of the most important takeaways is that these benefits are not automatically or equally distributed. Access, design, and governance all play a role in determining who benefits from what and how. And more broadly, this research suggests that while climate change is a global crisis, meaningful action can occur at a local level. Cities like Vienna demonstrate that people-centered, community-driven approaches can make climate adaptation more tangible and more effective. So in that sense, urban green spaces are not just spaces within a city. They're spaces where we can come together to build a brighter future. Thank you.